Welcome to a public service announcement edition of the Cloud Architects podcast. I'm Nicholas Blank. I'm here with my co-host, Chris Goosen.
Hello.
And we have the subject of our PSA, Greg Taylor.
Morning. Thank you.
You know, that is probably... Go on.
I was going to say, that's not Greg Taylor from Greg's Mowing. That's Greg Taylor from Microsoft.
Well,
Yes.
I'm a multi-purpose, I can do both. So,
I feel with the niceness that you are presenting, that you're taking away from the very gravitas of the situation that we're facing, that Basic Auth is going to be switched off. And before you turn that dial or switch to the next podcast, which is much nicer than this one, not that there should be any, we want to point out that this is a very clear and present situation that a lot of our customers are facing. There seems to be ambiguity that Microsoft was really doing it this time around. So let me open up with that question. Greg, are you actually going to switch off Basic Auth?
yes, we are. This time we really mean it. Which, and I've said that to a few customers recently, right? And it always makes them chuckle as well, because clearly this has not been an easy path, right? Funnily enough, when I started on this particular program 3 years ago, which is when we started, September 2019, we announced we were going to turn off Basic Auth in a year, and 6 months later we realized that was impossible because nobody had done anything.
Yes.
But when I sort of looked at some internal, docs around deprecating things, it was a very simple process. I looked and it said, announce you're going to stop something, customers will stop using it, and then you can turn it off. And it was just 3 steps. And I thought, well, that looks pretty straightforward. Turns out it's a little bit harder than that. But this time, seriously, we are going to start turning off Basic Auth in Exchange Online for a number of protocols, starting in less than a month from when we're doing this recording. So the beginning of October 2022, it's going to start getting pretty real for some customers.
So I think that's, I think it's great that we can kind of sort of echo or vocalize or amplify, probably is the right word, amplify the message, right? Because we've all obviously been following this probably since 2019 when you first started working on it.
Probably.
And I'm sure we've had customers sort of talk to us about this probably since 2019 when you first started working on it. But I think we're at the sort of point now where the fence sitting potentially, or sort of folks who aren't necessarily clear about exactly what's happening, kind of really need to get themselves going. And do you guys have some sort of does Microsoft have some sort of telemetry data? I mean, do you know what the extent is of folks who are still using legacy? I mean, is it like shockingly high, or is it just we're doing our due diligence high?
Absolutely, I have telemetry. So we started capturing data 18 months ago on a per tenant basis, per protocol, per tenant basis. I know every 30 minutes which tenants in the last 30 minutes have used which protocol with Basic Auth across all of our tenants. Trust me, that is a lot of data, right? Patterns also show us what we learned as well is enormously interesting. I know how many people are still using Basic Auth. I'm not going to give you the numbers, but let me just tell you that, I did a similar call with some internal Microsoft folks yesterday, and I asked them to guess how many people they thought were still using Basic Auth, and they were woefully wrong in terms of, there's a lot of people still using it. So listen, let me first say as well, having the opportunity to come and talk a bit about it, you and I might be bored about it, right? Or some customers or people who are listening to this might be like, oh my God, that whole Basic Auth thing again. But let me tell you, there are many, many customers who do not seem to know this is coming and are going to be caught by surprise. So anything we can do here to sort of help customers when email stops working, because that's what is going to happen. Email, calendar, and apps and scripts, those things are just going to stop working in about a month or so. Anything we can do to help them would be great. Point them at this, tell them what to do. But the data we've gathered is fascinating because it tells me things like, Tuesday's our busiest day of the week. more you can tell where the weekends are by looking at the data and the telemetry. Some people, I'm going to tell you this, some people don't sync their mobile phones at the weekends. They actually turn off syncing email at the weekends. I mean, isn't that crazy?
That's crazy.
So there are dips in active sync traffic at the weekends. POP and IMAP, heavily in use still.
Wow.
And in certain segments, like kind of, the educational sector, SMB, small, medium business type customers, lots of POP and IMAP.
Yeah.
I've used POP for 30 years. Why should I change now?
Yeah.
Well, because Outlook, if you're using Outlook as your client, doesn't support OAuth with POP3 or IMAP 4. So you can't use Outlook anymore if you're using POP and IMAP and you're using Outlook. So anyway, all of this kind of stuff.
That's an interesting point though, because if you think about it, like, why would you still be using POP or IMAP, right? Because any even somewhat modern device these days
because
is going to have a client on it, right? But something that you set up 30 years ago or whatever, like, those devices, chances are they're not still around, right? Are they? I mean, are you running?
Thunderbird is still around.
But Thunderbird surely has been updated by now.
Thunderbird does OAuth.
It does.
For POP
doesn't
and
mean
IMAP.
that you use it.
Right, but
No,
right
no,
now,
it can use OAuth.
And it isn't. I mean, a Microsoft person saying, "Hey, you should use Thunderbird," isn't exactly fairly common, but I'll say it, right? Because if you are on a license that only allows POP and IMAP type connectivity, which is one thing, so that could be one reason, Chris. There's actually a whole bunch of reasons, I think, why people still do. They want to use what used to be the kiosk license or the F1 license,
is that
whatever,
the
right?
Frontline F1.
Right. So they get the F1 license. So they can use browser or POP or IMAP, an active sync, let's say, right? And so they don't want to use the browser. They want to use a, air quotes, fat client. And so they've been using Outlook. I've got customers who, I had one customer I spoke to, 4,000 installations in retail of Outlook 2003 doing POP. And so, and this is last year. And so for a customer like that, this is pretty impactful, right? And because the machines they're running them on are ancient too, probably. So they probably can't use an up-to-date browser. So there's a whole consequence of a change like this. And my job is in trying to shut this thing off is not to upset all our customers and give them all lots of work to do, but make sure consultants earn good living out of helping these customers do it. That's not the goal. The goal is protecting the data and the user accounts from compromise, because the other side of what I spend my weeks doing, apart from getting people to stop using it, is protecting customers from breach, because I see them breached every single day, and some of the biggest customers in the world that I talk to are surprised because I simply point out, you've been breached over IMAP and here's the evidence that shows it, and then it's panic. So this is why we're shutting off Basic Auth, right? Not just to make lives hard for everyone.
Sure.
Basic Auth means there's no MFA, there's no second factor, and we are incredibly vulnerable to password spray attacks. And we've mentioned this in previous shows, that a password spray attack is as easy to, well, we don't even have to buy it. I could buy a password spray attack for not a lot of money if I wanted to buy a semi-commercial tool, but I can go to GitHub, and there's at least 3 repositories the last time I looked that had working code and examples to show how to do a password spray attack against a Microsoft workload with protocol choosers and switches. So the stuff is not difficult to do.
No, and let me clarify one thing as well. So Basic Auth doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't mean no MFA, right? So just let's come back to that just for a second, right? Basic Auth means my username and password are sent directly to Exchange, encoded by nothing more than base 64 every time I want to retrieve some data. And an Exchange uses those creds and proxies those creds to both your own identity provider for authentication or Azure or whatever, and then to Azure AD for things like conditional access. But essentially, your device is using this basic authentication header type of communication to talk to Exchange, because you could do OAuth and just provide a username and password. You don't have to do MFA. MFA is like, I want to authenticate using OAuth, which is directly done to Azure. I get a token back in exchange. MFA is an option at that stage, right? So sorry, it comes up on the blog sometimes because people think like OAuth equals MFA, and OAuth does not equal MFA.
And I'm sure
it gives you the option of doing MFA.
Perfect. Right. So the password spray thing's fascinating because if you think about how stuff has changed over, the number of many years that some of us have been working in this industry, right? Where I remember, your login name was not your email address. So people would log in with a UPN. You remember the old @local, people used to create in Active Directory and all of that, right? And then they'd have an email address. And of course, all the users couldn't remember their login names, but they always remembered their email address. And they were different 20 years ago because the security folks were like, well, let's keep them separate. So your login name is also secret, but your email address is public. So then, of course, users forgot their login names. So now we just make them all the same. So now your email address is your username. So we've essentially given away one of the things to guess. And now all we have to do is password spray to guess your password. And so, it's interesting when I do a lot of calls with some customers at the moment, and I look at their data and I look at how many times they've seen successful logins, let's just say in IMAP. Take IMAP as a great example. And it's a great example because right now IMAP is the target of a lot of these attacks because it's enabled everywhere where I haven't already turned it off or where the customer hasn't done something. And so, let's just say over 3 days, you might see 5,000 successful IMAP logins from these apps or users that are still using it. But then sometimes you see 20,000 account not provisioned errors, meaning I couldn't find the username. Why the 20,000 attempts to log in using IMAP to a tenant with a username that couldn't be found? Password spray. Right? So, and then there's a whole bunch of bad passwords, and you're thinking, well, if these are apps that are using it, if these are mostly in most of the large companies, people don't use IMAP for their email client protocol, right? That would be really strange. So these are applications that they are relying on. They could be Oracle or Jira or something else. Well, those apps don't get the password wrong. How often does your application, but the number of failed password attempts over IMAP is astonishing. So then it just screams somebody is trying a random combination of usernames and passwords to get into your data. And then I'll see, it's interesting too, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit about Mac in a few weeks as well, right? Which is that, when you look at login data for a tenant, you spot patterns jump out. So, when I look at it with a customer and there's 5,000 logins for IMAP for this account, these 5 accounts, they know use IMAP. Maybe they log in 5,000 times a month because they're, logging in constantly. And then you see a single user account that logs in once in 30 days. How many people or apps do you know log in once in 30 days? So, that just says, so they guessed a username and password then.
Yeah, that's
anyway.
And I think the thing here is that apart from the mechanism of how easily done this is, these credential dumps are just everywhere, right? I think I looked at Have I Been Pwned like the day before yesterday, and I think he's getting on to almost 12 billion now. 12 billion compromised, sets of credentials in his database. So the credentials are available. There's nothing. Oftentimes, there's no MFA protecting this,
right.
And then obviously password reuse is a massive thing, right?
Huge.
Folks are still reusing passwords, and so the breach isn't your company's data. The breach is someone on some cat website using their corporate email and a password that they've also used for work.
Yeah.
That's where the problem comes in. So I can the data would be fascinating to look at.
It is fascinating to see, and also, I feel like when sometimes with some of these customers, I explain what I see, and there's both disdain or disbelief. Then reality kicks in, and then they realize, oh yeah, IMAP isn't actually turned off for everyone, and then they realize that an account's been breached or two or whatever, and it happens all the time. And so there are some quick solutions. I tell them, like authentication policies in Exchange Online are a quick, dirty way of figuring this out, right? So if there are 6 accounts using IMAP and Basic Auth still because you haven't yet fixed the app, create an Auth policy, allow Basic Auth for IMAP to true, apply it to those 6 accounts, and then uncheck the box in the admin center or change the default Auth policy to false for everyone else. And then every other Basic Auth IMAP request is going to get rejected. Only the 6 you want can do it. Problem solved. I mean, that's like one of the first things when customers are literally under attack from Basic Auth. One of the first things we get them to do.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's kind of it's fascinating to me.
That's worthwhile guidance, though, right? Because I think again, we tend to find I think that the tech press jumps on every Microsoft decision in a way that isn't favorable, right? And I really don't like the way that a lot of these things are reported. And I think so. There was just in July there was the disabling internet macros or macros from internet-based sources in Outlook, right? And then it was, everyone kind of went crazy about the fact that Microsoft was doing this, right? I don't like the way that things get spun, and it's usually spun for headlines, right? And we all know that. But what we're saying here is, yes, there is a change coming, but also we're saying, well, hey, there are ways here that you can try and if you have some apps that potentially need to be remediated, obviously the advice right now is please remediate those apps. Start working on that process. And if this is an old vendor app and the vendor isn't doing the support that they need to be doing, obviously non-Microsoft, like get onto the vendor, because guaranteed they've got other customers that should be pressurizing them as well. And
so I entirely agree, right? Some of these and some of the apps. So often when I talk to a customer as well, it's like, we go through kind of what all the connections are, and there's a lot of IMAP and POP, some fairly common apps there, but there's a lot of EWS based apps too. So the question usually goes along, or the conversation goes along like, so is this a first party app? You own the code, you have a developer, or is a third party app? Now, if you own the code, right, all of these protocols all support OAuth. You can go and hopefully modify the code. It's fairly trivial, right? If it's a third-party app, then now you need to have a conversation with the software vendor. Do you have a version of the app that supports OAuth? Do I have to upgrade? How much, And so I've been trying to have that conversation with some of the biggest companies a long time ago, because of course it takes a while to do any of these things. To redevelop an app to change the authentication type sounds simple, but obviously it takes time. So I'll say one thing that we announced beginning of September, because reality is, like, we know beginning of October when we start turning off tenants, and we will, to your original point, Nick, oh yeah, we're going to turn a lot of people off. Well, I've already, by the way, turned off millions of tenants. We've turned off Basic Auth in millions of tenants, and I've turned off individual protocols in millions of tenants more. So, if you only use in your tenant EWS and maybe Outlook, let's say ActiveSync and Outlook, I've probably already turned off POP, IMAP, and PowerShell for you. And you'll know that if you look in the message center. But despite that, clearly there will be some interruption of service for some customers. And so if that's the case, email stops working. This could well be it. Go in the message center, have a look. You'll see a service health dashboard notification if it just happened. You'll see a message center post either way. And they're both going to give you links to some docs and guidance. And one of the things they're going to point you to is the ability to re-enable. You're going to get a one-time opportunity to go and say, I didn't see this coming, or I didn't know this app used Basic Auth. Please re-enable POP or IMAP or ActiveSync or whatever. And that will be good through till the end of the year. Now, if you want to avoid the interruption of service, you can tell us during the month of September that you know you need a bit more time for POP or IMAP or whatever it is. You can go in the admin center. You can tell us you want to do that. We will get the request. We will not turn that thing off in October. But all of that, there are a bunch of customers who don't read the message center. A bunch of customers don't read the blog, listen to the podcasts, and so on. So yeah, they're going to be surprised. So, I've built this option in whereby customers can get one more opportunity to re-enable. But to your point, Chris, you don't just re-enable and then sit and wait for January to come around where we do it all again. Because I swear, in January, when we turn it off, it's off. So figure out what broke and what you can do about it as quickly as you can.
I just actually, as you were saying that, the 1st of October date, I'm actually going on vacation on the 1st of October. So I'm not sure if that
Smart.
is fortuitous planning or if that's just going to be an absolute nightmare. But I've got to have some confidence in the fact that we've been working with customers through this process.
Yeah, we've been driving down. Usage has dropped enormously. I'd love to be able to share numbers, but that's a bit tricky, right? But I can tell you that the Basic Auth usage has dropped significantly over the last few months for two key reasons. So one is the partnership with Apple, which you may have read about. We've published a blog on that. We've been working with Apple for a few years on a way to automatically migrate devices using Basic Auth to Modern Auth. It's mainly aimed at the sort of small, medium business end of things because it won't apply if there are MDM policies or anything on the phone. And so small, medium business don't typically get that kind of stuff, right? So that will hopefully help, and it has already helped migrate a lot of devices. And then the other big thing is I've been turning on the Enable Modern Auth flag for Outlook 2013 in a whole bunch of tenants over the last month, because that it's the OAuth 2 client profile enabled flag, right? Which is in the admin center. It's the equivalent to going into settings Modern Auth, and that there's a checkbox for Enable Modern Auth for Outlook 2013. Well, that checkbox was only set to true by default in August of 2017. So if you had a tenant created before then, it would be false. And so even if you had an up-to-date version of Outlook, it would not do Modern Auth unless that box was checked. So we started checking the box a month ago. And I will, it has made quite an impact. And the number of cases of support cases is 0. So what's happened is Outlook, because it's up to date, the user's already logged into Teams or OneDrive or something else. The user's already logged into our service. Outlook, after that setting gets changed in the server side on their tenant, Outlook restarts and goes, I can do Modern Auth now. Awesome. Switches, gets a token, logs in, user carries on. So over the last month, these two things have really helped drive usage down. But despite that, there will be some people caught out.
So what you're saying is that you've gone from Power BI to analyze the stats to just using plain old Excel now.
I use whatever it takes to try and because with a problem this size, you have to sort of pick off tactical things. How can I do this? What can I do here? What can I do there? Right? And so it's been really interesting to sort of look at the data, apply some experience and knowledge of the product and how these things work. You can't just look at the data and make decisions. You have to sort of understand the context of how customers work and what kind of configuration they've got and what might break, and then make judgments. And what's kind of crazy are the numbers, right? So when you sort of think, let's pick a number of customers that we are going to test this theory on, it's 20,000 tenants. And we've done things to 20,000 tenants and there's not been a peep, right? It's like no noise at all. So you think, well, that was a bit of a non-event. So you have to step it up, and you end up with some of the numbers are just silly. And I will tell you that the OAuth 2 flag I've turned on in over 500,000 tenants.
Wow.
Are we
half a
allowed to
million.
ask you how many tenants there are, more or less?
You can ask. I'm not going to answer that one.
Oh, it's worth the question. I
Sure.
wanted
A lot.
to
Let me just say a lot, right? We
I
have a
wanted
lot.
to.
Yeah,
Sorry.
go on. No,
No,
you go
no.
ahead. Sorry, Nick.
So uh, we have customers, we talk about basic auth and it's an attack vector and it's a shoulder shrug. And we have some customers outright saying, so what if someone guesses a password? And I think that the general perception, since we did state that, you can go to GitHub and you can get some scripts and do this stuff and it's really easy. They think that it's just, or some of our customers think, it's a bunch of teenagers doing stuff and they're bored and the threat isn't really that high. But there were a bunch of teenagers that were not so bored and rather profitable in the news a little while ago and caused a little bit of an event with both Microsoft and Okta, if I remember correctly, and that was Lapsus. There was just a bunch of teenagers who, well, I shouldn't say just, they were teenagers who understood what they were doing and they had created a criminal enterprise. And not that I want to ring the fear bell out of entertainment value at all. There is a very real criminal element that Microsoft has been very instrumental in bringing to not only to justice, but also in terms of working with the police in various different countries. But this is a very real criminal enterprise that you guys are fighting.
For sure, and there are many examples like similar to those that you used, where there are organized attacks. We are very aware of that. We're doing everything we can. I sit through part of the project I'm working on. This whole Basic Auth thing forms part of a monthly security review that goes on, and I get to hear kind of some of the things that we've discovered and uncovered, and what we do to mitigate them. And I work with some really smart people, right? Who we employ some really smart people who can think in very creative ways, just like they can, right? It's a game. To them, it's a game. To us, it's pretty serious. And so we're doing an awful lot to try and protect our customers' data. And it goes back to what I was saying here, right? Which is that's really what the goal here is for us, protecting our customers. It's not our data, it's your data.
Yeah.
Right. But and back to Chris's point as well, which is the sort of way it can be. It's very hard for us too, because Microsoft are doing this evil thing by breaking all our email. Well, I mean, it's a hard place to be in sometimes. It's a balance for us between trying to help do the right thing here, be an industry leader, right, and do the right thing and raise the bar for security all up for this kind of industry, and not interrupt customers. And I, I'm a customer guy, I always have been, and I don't like the fact that stuff will break, right? And I'm aware that customers use email for the most fascinating and perhaps inappropriate use cases, and those things might stop working, and I don't like that. I'll tell you one quick story, if I may, right? It's
Please.
In talking to a customer, and this is the impact of stuff, and also this plays into the story of the sort of comments that we get of like, oh, I see you're gonna, you've delayed again. Why can't you just turn off Basic Auth for everyone? Or, oh, you're giving people a last chance exception. Just turn it off and be done with it. Well, you can only say that if you've got no idea how many people use it and what they use it for. It's a very blasé attitude, right? Because, I spoke to a healthcare hospital a few months ago, and we were looking at their data, and I'm like, hey, you got a whole bunch of iPhones using Basic Auth. They're using the native mail app on iPhones. What are we going to, we need to do something about that. And they say, oh, that's the transplant team. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, they said, well, they can't use Outlook Mobile. This was the interesting one, just tell you this. So, like, well, they can't use Outlook Mobile because the new email delivery alert isn't loud enough to wake them up. And I was kind of, whoa, hang on a second. Right?
Wow.
So what they're saying is, when somebody has died and they need to take an organ out, or somebody needs a transplant put in, I'm sure there's probably a more technical medical term for that, right?
Yes.
We email them, and out and they might be asleep. And Outlook Mobile's new email tone isn't loud enough to wake them up. So that's why we use the native email client. I'm like, wow. I mean, A, that's awesome feedback for the Outlook team, right? but B, they're using Basic Auth on their right. And so if we just cut off Basic Auth, that would stop. They would not get email. And I think the consequences are pretty obvious. And so I talk to customers all the time who are using email for critical services and, life-saving operations. And so we got to get them away from Basic Auth because we are going to turn it off. And that's why I go back to why I always had in mind there was going to be a one last attempt, because if you really interrupt service for some of these customers, some really bad stuff's going to go down. And so, we need to just be somewhere balanced on the line between the two, right? We're a utility. People treat email like a electrical service in the internet, right? If we're not there, it's pretty inconvenient to say the least. Yeah. Anyway,
and it's funny to think though that we've all known each other for a very long time, and we've all been in this email thing for a very long time, and to think back to on-premises Exchange days, you would never have considered yourself a utility, right? Because you were building the platform and folks were collaborating with the platform, and you were an enabler, but you weren't necessarily a utility. But now, because of the cloud and all of the wonderful marvels that the cloud bring, I mean, it brings a responsibility as well. But I feel like there's always this narrative about Microsoft doesn't care about its customers. Microsoft has enough money; they don't care about their customers. It's absolutely, not the case. And if anyone listening to this, hopefully that is very, very clear to the audience that we're trying to do. Microsoft is trying to do the right thing, for customers and for everyone. So, Greg, before we let you go here, let's I wanted to just kind of clarify real quick, if we can, the stance on the clients. So obviously 2013 requires some config, but will work, right? Anything. So I'm talking Outlook specifically.
Outlook,
now.
Outlook for Windows 2013 needs the enable ADAL registry key setting. Yep.
Right.
Everything above that should be doing modern auth by default.
Right. And anything below that is no bueno.
Is gone.
Okay. I think that's very well understood from the documentation that is available as well.
Yeah, and interestingly, some customers, I'll tell you as well, so even though they've got Outlook 2016 or newer, there's two reasons why it still might be doing Basic Auth. One is the OAuth 2 client profile enable flag, the org-wide flag that I talked about. I'm turning on for a whole bunch of customers. I'm not touching the big customers, right? Well, not yet. I will be. Yeah, if I turn off Basic Auth, I'm turning on modern auth for Outlook. Otherwise, Outlook can't connect. Yeah. But also the other one is, I see this sometimes, GPOs have been pushed out to sort of set the enable ADAL key back to 0. And this actually is a fairly common thing where a few years ago there was some add into Outlook and it didn't work. And, the solution was turn off modern auth and oh, look, now everything works. And guess what? Then they forget they pushed a GPO to turn off modern auth on a whole bunch of clients.
And so that the person who built that GPO no longer is there.
Right. So you got to track it down. So if you see Outlook 2016, which is Microsoft Office, 16, right, in the user agent string, if you see that, which could represent any version newer than 2016, in Azure AD logs for Basic Auth MAPI, then that's probably a GPO or somebody's been finagling around in the registry.
Finagling. That's a technical
term. I knew a guy who edited the registry once, and 3 days later he crashed his car. So let that be a warning for you, right? And then, pretty much all the other clients, Active Sync, for the most part, right, removing the account from the device and adding it back fixes most Active Sync clients, right? Because as long as your phone is relatively up to date, all these apps support OAuth now. So they're the sort of key ones, I'd really say. And if you're using Pop and IMAP, it's either Thunderbird, browser, or stop using Pop and IMAP.
Yep, fair enough. And then, so there is some I think really good documentation on docs.microsoft.com, and I'll put a link in the show notes here for anyone who isn't quite sure if they're affected yet and wants some information about how to tell. Is there any other resources we should be sort of pointing or directing folks to?
I think make sure if you're an admin, you're looking in the message center, right? That's how we communicate change to our customers. There's been numbers in the message center. We've been sending usage numbers in the message center for months with how many users we see. And the Azure AD Sign-in Reports is the right place to go to see who's still using it if they are. There's a bunch of other good public resources and you know, there's a lot of good people who've done short articles about how to reconfigure this or do that. I think the biggest challenge though with this whole basic auth thing is there is no easy button, right? Generally for most, you know, for the larger, the more complex the customer, it's like figure out what we're using, figure out what the impact is, and then what we want to do. And for some customers, the answer is, you know what, do nothing. Just let it stop and, you know, use a different client or something. And there aren't many who can do that, particularly at the larger end of things. But, you know, with some small customers, it's just use a different email client, switch to the browser, you know, whatever it might be.
Well, thank you, Greg. We know you have some other time commitments, so don't want to keep you too long, but really appreciate you coming on again. We love having you on, by the way. It's always funny, and Nick sort of alluded to the little old ladies jab earlier from the previous episode that we had you, but
It's fun. It's good fun. I like chatting with you guys too.
Hopefully, the next one we can do in person somewhere around the world.
Thought.
Yeah.
Well, you know, if Ignite was a little bit larger, we would be hopefully putting a microphone into your hand or a headset on your head and asking you technically relevant questions about finagling and other things that happened.
That would be delightful. But I'm not sure it's going to happen this year. But let's hope for a big event next year. Should we do that?
Yeah.
Let's plan on it. If we think hard enough collectively, we can make it happen. Everyone.
Thank you,
Greg, has always been awesome. Thank you thanks for being on the show.
Pleasure. Thank you.